Hello students and welcome in the online session of class 8 science chapter 12 friction. This is the second video of the lesson friction. Now what is friction? What are the factors which are responsible for friction? What are the factors which affect the friction, causes of the friction? We have already discussed in the last video. Now let us see what are the topics to be covered in this video today. So today we are going to learn about four different types of friction, and they are static friction, sliding friction, rolling friction and fluid friction. So these four different types of frictions we will understand today. So let's start first with the static friction. Okay, static word means which is stable, which is at rest. Okay, static words mean which is not changing, which is stable. So static friction is the force which is required to overcome a friction at instant an object starts moving from rest. Okay, suppose if an object is at rest position, then the friction which is acting between the ground and the object which is at rest, that friction is called as static friction, right? And you know this friction is very strong friction, because if anything is at rest and to move that object from rest position to moving state, it requires a lot of force. So this force which is required to overcome the friction between a resting object and the ground is called as the static friction. Okay, so what is static friction? It is the opposing or the resisting force between the two solid surfaces. Okay, so this is the force which is resisting the motion of the two objects, right? So there are two objects here, this box and the ground. So there is an resisting force between them. So this friction which is acting between the surface of the box and the surface of the ground, because of that more force have to be applied to this box to get it moving. So this friction which is acting between the object which are at rest positions is called as the static friction, right? Now here also in this diagram you can see that this person wants to initiate motion to the box. The person wants to move the box, right? So what the person has to do first, the person has to apply the force. But how much force has to be applied? The force applied by the man should be the force of static friction. The friction which is acting between the box and the surface is very strong, is more. So the person has to apply force which should exceed this frictional force, and this frictional force is the static frictional force. Static friction which acts between the resting objects. Okay, so force which is required to overcome the friction which opposes the movement of an object is the static friction. Okay, so I repeat once again, force which is required to overcome the friction at instant an object starts moving from rest. Okay, if an object starts moving from rest position, so at that time the friction which is acting between the objects is called as the static friction, right? Static word is used because the object is starting from rest, so that's why static friction. Now, next type is sliding friction, right? So friction which is acting between the two surfaces in which one surface is sliding over the other surface. Okay, that time the friction which is acting between the two objects is called as the sliding friction, right? Now you can see here that sliding friction is less than the static friction. Static friction is the strongest among all the friction, because to move a object from rest position requires a lot of force, because the two objects are interlocked among each other, so that force, that friction is the strongest one. Now when one surface is sliding over the other surface, the sliding friction comes into play. Okay, suppose you can see here that some of the children are sliding in the ice, right? So this device in which they are sitting, okay, and the ice, they are in contact with each other. Okay, so this device is just sliding over the ice. So when one surface is sliding over the other surface, then the friction which is in between these two surfaces is called the sliding friction. Now in the second picture you can see that a child is sliding over the slide. So the surface of the child's body and the surface of the slide are in contact with each other. Now the boy is sliding downside, right? So the friction which acts between these two surfaces is called the sliding friction, and this friction is always less than the static friction. If you have to start a box from rest position, you require more force. But suppose somebody is, start if the box starts moving, and then you have to just push it to continue that movement, requires less force. So sliding friction is less than the static friction. Okay, here also you can see that the person is sliding over ice, so the friction acting between the two surfaces is the sliding friction. So what happens in sliding friction? The friction that occurs when one solid surface slides over the other solid surface, then the sliding friction is acting. Okay, so this is sliding friction. Then third is rolling friction. Okay, when the rolling friction will act? When one surface is rolling over the another surface. That time the friction which is acting between the two surfaces is called the rolling friction. Okay, here in the picture you can see that there is a push on the wheel is pushed, force is applied on the wheel, so the wheel rolls forward, the wheel started rolling. But now you can see that the surface of the wheel and the ground are in contact with each other. So here the friction which is acting, which is opposing this rolling motion, is called the rolling friction. Fine. So when one body rolls over the other surface, the resistance to its motion, the force which will oppose this rolling motion, is known as the rolling friction. Fine. Here also you can see in the picture, the force is applied on this box. This box has wheels downside, so the box starts moving in this direction. But the friction which will act between the wheels and the ground, there will be friction, and this friction will be definitely in opposite direction to motion. So this friction which is acting when some surface is rolling over the other, that time the friction is named as the rolling friction. Okay, this rolling friction is more or less than the sliding. Static one is the strongest one, then second number comes to sliding, and the third number goes to rolling. Rolling friction is very weak. That's why the luggage which we use for traveling, they all have wheels, because it is easy to carry the luggage when the wheels roll on the surface, because rolling friction is very less when the wheels are present on the lower side of the luggage, because rolling friction is a very weak friction and very less force has to be applied to move the object. That's why the luggage have wheels nowadays. Okay, because rolling friction is a weak friction and very less force will be required to carry on the luggage then. So next you can see here that ball bearings can reduce this friction. Okay, rolling friction can be reduced by ball bearings. Okay, ball bearings, you can see here that these ball bearings are used between hubs and the axles. Okay, like two surfaces which are rolling, when the wheel will move, here also you can see the diagram, there are small ball like structures fit in between the two surfaces. This surface will also roll and this surface will also roll. So if the two will come in contact with each other, there will be friction. So to reduce that friction, ball bearings are used. These ball like small elements, small structures are used in between. Okay, and these small structures, they are called the ball bearings. Here also you can see the ball bearings. Okay, so these ball bearings are used to reduce the friction between the two rolling objects. Fine. So rolling friction is when the two objects are rolling against each other, and the rolling friction can be more reduced by the use of ball bearings in between. So see, these balls will also rotate in the middle. So when they will rotate, so rolling friction will act, right? So when the rolling friction is a very weak friction, so very less force will be required for movement, and the friction will also be reduced here. So you can see here the increasing order of the frictions here, force of friction. So you can see the very strongest one, the very weakest one is the rolling friction, very weak friction. That is why you can see the luggage have wheels in this, in the lower side, because with the helps of the wheel it becomes very easy to carry the luggage. Friction is very less, very weak friction, rolling. Then just a little more than the rolling friction is the sliding friction. Sliding friction is little stronger than the rolling friction. If we have to slide a luggage on the surface, okay, then sliding friction works there. And the strongest one is the static friction. Static friction requires a lot of force if you want to, move an object from the rest position. You can see a sofa here, and sofa is little heavy. So when we apply force on this, that means in between the surface of this sofa and the ground, static friction is present because the sofa is in rest position. And now if we want to move it, we have to apply a lot of force to overcome this static friction. Then only the sofa will move. If something is just sliding, already sliding, and you are just continue want to continue it sliding, then sliding friction will work there. Okay, and if something is rolling, when one solid surface is rolling on the other surface, then rolling friction is acting in between the two surfaces. So the strongest one is the static friction and the weakest one is the rolling friction among these. Okay, so this is the increasing order of the force of friction. Okay, now next is fluid friction. Fluid friction means the friction which is present in the fluids, liquids. Okay, so you know that water is a liquid. So water also has friction. There is resistance. When we have to swim, we have to apply a lot of force from our body so that we can just swim. So water is also applying pressure on our body, so that water will strike the surface of the organism, like this person is swimming here. So the surface, the body surface of the person and the water, they are in contact with each other, they are rubbing against each other. So here works the fluid friction. That friction which is in between the water and the body of the organism is the fluid friction, and this fluid friction will not allow the person to swim, right? So what are the methods, what are the different things by which this fluid friction can be reduced? So the frictional force which is exerted by the fluids is called fluid friction, and it is also called as drag. Fluid friction is also known by the name drag. Fluid friction can be minimized or can be reduced by giving suitable shapes to the bodies moving in the fluids. All the boats, ships, they have a particular shape which helps these objects to smoothly uh, move in water, right? And that shape is called a streamline shape. Okay, what is streamline shape? Now you can see the boat shape is like this, right? So here you can see that the starting point is narrow, the ending point is also very narrow, and in the middle there is a broadness in the body. Fishes also have a streamline shape, like this the fish's shape. So see, the starting end is narrow, ending part of the body is also narrow, but in the middle the body is broad. So this type of shape is called a streamline shape. So this pointed shape in the center, in the start of the body, helps to reduce the friction, helps to cut the resistance of water, and easily the body can move inside the water. So this shape, streamlined shape of the body, helps the body to just swim in water. So to overcome this fluid friction, bodies of the fishes and birds, they are streamlined. Birds fly in air. Birds also have a streamlined shape body. You see the shape of the bird. You see, this is the head portion, this is tail portion, like this. So you can see that there is a tail then. Okay, and here are the legs. So you see this starting part is also narrow, this ending part is also narrow, and in the middle the body is broad. So this shape is also called a streamlined shape. And air also has friction. Air also has a resistance. Air also exert pressure on the body. So to reduce that friction, to reduce that pressure, streamlined body is a must. Similarly, the ships and aeroplanes also have a streamlined shape. Aeroplane shape you can see here, streamlined, narrow. Here also narrow, and in the middle it is broad. So this is also a streamlined shape. So fluid friction can be reduced by giving a streamlined shape to the bodies so that the resistance, the friction can be reduced. Fine. So this is about fluid friction. Fluid friction is also known as drag. So here the chapter is over. Now let us discuss some of the questions related to the lesson. Okay. So see, first question is, give three instances where friction produces noticeable heat. Okay, so you have to give three examples where with the help of friction, with the help of rubbing, heat is produced. So first example we have learned in the video that when we rub our hands, when we rub the palms of our hand, then heat is generated in the palms. So during winter, what we do when there is more cold, we just rub both the palms against each other, and then a lot of heat is produced and we feel warm. Then second is rubbing of the matchsticks to make the fire. So that is also friction where heat is generated, right? And third one is parts of the car engine rubbing together causes it to overheat, right? Sometimes you might have seen in the movies or in the TV that the engine of the car gets very hot, and if we have to open it, so a lot of smoke is coming out, hot vapors are coming out from the engine of the car. So that is because the parts of the car engine are rubbing against each other, and because of that friction, that heat is generated. So these are the three examples where you can see that friction produces heat, rubbing produces heat. Now next question is, name two factors on which the magnitude of frictional force depends. We have to tell two factors on which the frictional force depends. So the first one is friction depends on the nature of the surface, whether the surface is rough or whether the surface is smooth. That will decide the that how much frictional force is acting between the surfaces. And second, friction depends on how hard the two surfaces press together. Okay, how much is the pressure of one object on the other, how much hard they are pressing against each other. Suppose there is a very heavy box, so that heavy box is pressed very hardly on the surface, so the frictional force will be also very more, and we need a lot of force to move that box. And if a very light box is kept on the surface, it is very easy to move because friction between the lightweight box and the ground is very less, because the box is pressed on the surface very lightly. So the second factor on which the friction depends is how hard the two surfaces are pressed against each other. Then the third question is, what is the use of ball bearings? We have just only read it, that ball bearings are used to reduce the friction. The next is why the soles of the shoes and tires of the cars, etc., they are grooved. Why there are designs made on the soles of the shoes and on the tires, why the designs are made. Okay, so it is done to provide shoes a better grip. So making designs on them will make the surface rough, and when the surface is rough, it will give a better grip on the surface, right? So when someone is moving, it should not slip down, right? For better grip, for making the surface rough, these type of things are done. Now, next one is list any three methods of reducing friction. You have to give three methods by which the friction can be reduced. So, first one is by using lubricants like grease, oil. When we use, so that can reduce the friction. Then, by using the ball bearings, you have seen using small balls in between the two surfaces, that can also reduce the friction. And then by polishing the surfaces, as you can see that slides are polished, so by polishing the surface also can reduce the friction. So these are the three methods. The next is name some special shape given to the objects to move in fluids. Which shape is given to the objects that are moving in fluids? So we have just learned that a streamlined shape will help the objects to move in the fluids, in liquids as well as in the air gases. Then next is you would not have forgotten the incident of astronaut Kalpana Chawla. Okay, you know how Kalpana Chawla died? There was an air crash, right? The device in which they were coming, the aircraft in which they were coming, it crashed. As soon as that aircraft entered the atmosphere of the earth, it crashed. And that is because of, friction. The speed of the aircraft was so much that when it entered the atmosphere of the earth, it just got the friction of the air. Okay, it just, rubbed against the air molecules, and the aircraft, blast. Because of friction, a lot of heat is generated, and the aircraft crashed. So what was the reason behind it? Okay, so let's read the reason. When air spacecraft or the aircraft re-enters the atmosphere, when the spacecraft was entering from the space again to the atmosphere, its surface gets extremely hot due to friction between the air and the spacecraft, right? And the spacecraft was moving with a high speed, and to protect the aircraft, its outer surface is covered with tiles of special material that can tolerate high heat. The reason of burning of spacecraft in which Kalpana Chawla was traveling was the heat by friction, right? So because a lot of friction between the air and the spacecraft, so the friction was so much that a lot of heat was generated and the spacecraft burned in fire. Okay, it got crashed, it got burst in fire, and that was the reason for the death of astronaut Kalpana Chawla. She belonged to India only, right? Now, okay, some more questions. What are lubricants? So, lubricants are the substances that are used to reduce the friction. Okay, this is the simple definition. Then, what is interlocking? So, what is interlocking? When the irregularities on the two surfaces in contact may collapse with each other. Okay, when the irregularities of the two surface get blocked against each other, they make collapse. Word you can use. Collapse means they get fixed amongst each other, or they get pressed among each other. You can use a lot of words here, and that is called interlocking. When the irregularities of the two surfaces come in contact with each other, get fixed among each other, so that is called interlocking. So here were the some extra questions which we discussed. I think the concepts are now more clear to you, and we have come to the end of the video. That is the summary that we have learned about the four different types of friction today: rolling friction, sliding friction, fluid friction, and static friction. Static friction is the strongest one, rolling friction is the weakest one among these three: rolling, sliding, and static, right? And then some extra questions also be discussed. So here the chapter is over. We'll complete it in Google Meet also. Till then, all of you read the lesson from your textbook, find out your problems, and just query it. Okay, just ask the questions to get the solutions. Okay, till then all of you stay home and stay safe.